In the question and exploration about our culture and the American country's relationship with psychedelic drugs, particularly with the war on drugs and the Schedule I classification of such things as LSD and psilocybin and DMT, it's helpful to map out the polarities on the relevant dimensions. And so the first thing is on the science dimension. You have the polarity of science versus superstition. On the scientific side, by irrationally first scheduling 1,000-year-old substances as illegal drugs in Schedule I with no supposed therapeutic value, the US government denied not only thousands of years of history, but also present-day history of phenomenal results coming psychologically and physically from the healthy use of psychedelics in a therapeutic setting. And so having scheduled these drugs and lumped them together, where heroin is lumped in with LSD and psilocybin mushrooms that have been eaten by native peoples for thousands of years is lumped in with crack cocaine. What we're doing is we're obfuscating science. So there's no science in the Schedule I classification. There's no science in the ignoring of large bodies of data. And the most damning element in the posture of US government is the banning of all science, meaning effectively through a superstitious campaign and the announcement that this was not a series of substances that could have any beneficial value. All science was stopped on a number of levels: humiliation and cultural shame, lack of funding, boycotting, risk of arrest. There is an extraordinary length to which the US government has gone to in order to ban science, and has justified that with superstition about the consequences of drugs, with exaggerations and in some cases falsified scientific reports, but mostly just the refusal to acknowledge the very large number of distinctions. It'd be very much as if all color was banned just because certain colors were offensive. And so we have a boycott of science, and we currently have a support of superstition. Now, the next is where we come to the basis for authority, legal authority to arrest people and imprison them. And this is done in a framework where trust is given to government on the basis that of public interest. We grant a government the right to have certain legal and military capacities on the condition that it acts in public interest. And so when you have policing and FBI and DEA, etc., working with a budget of public money, the question is it in support of public interest, or is it in support of abuse or irrational punishment? And this is a very important distinction. And in order to assess that, if you take, for example, the seatbelt law, where people are given hundreds of dollars of fines if they don't wear their seatbelt. And so there's a combination of public campaigning, wear a seatbelt, it's good for your health, and there is actually science based on this. And we're going to penalize you if you don't wear a seatbelt. Now, it's hard to say unless you have statistical data which is going to hurt you more, the seatbelt law or death from not wearing a seatbelt, because it is your own life, should you be allowed to make that judgment call, number one. And number two, it's your money, and that money would have been spent presumably in a way that would be invested in your retirement, that would allow you to eat healthier food, etc. And so there's a little bit of a shaky but understandable relationship with this kind of supportive justice or punitive, of discipline, and irrational punishment. It's overall in everyone's interest to wear a seatbelt. And in the case of psychedelics, you have to ask yourself, if you took a smoke of marijuana, and in order to protect you from the supposed harm of the smoke of marijuana, your family falls apart because you are ripped out of your household to put in jail, so your family income collapses, your marriage collapses, the bond with child and parent collapses, you're eating crappy food that's hurting you a lot more than the marijuana smoke. And so if you look, is the punishment for taking a drug, whether it's smoking a joint or taking LSD or taking a mushroom, in these specific cases where you have non-addictive substances that are providing, like everything else, an intelligent risk-reward analysis, is the government using taxpayer money to harm its people, securing trust, securing money, securing authority, then turning on its own people with that trust and authority in a way that hurts them 10, 20, 100 times more than the supposed help? Or is it just irrational punishment? And if you look at the actual impact on families at every level, mentally, emotionally, financially, the data is in that the US government has been traumatizing and brutalizing more of its citizens than any other country in the world for doing something that, in the case of psilocybin, LSD, DMT, MDMA, is not even on the charts of national harm, despite the fact that tens and tens of millions of Americans have to break the law to kind of replace the science that the US government refuses to do. So in this area, the US government is not supporting families by stopping someone taking an MDMA substance with their wife in a therapeutic setting. They're not supporting a family by preventing someone to go to a professional therapist and take LSD that could be transformative in areas such as PTSD. They're administering an irrational punishment. It's neither based on science, but also in terms of the social goal of discouragement. The discouragement, the punishment, is 10 to 100 times worse than the supposed thing that is being prevented. When you add to that the abuse of power in terms of the roughly $80,000 a year it takes to incarcerate someone, the stress on the court system, the stress on the economy, you see an enormous imbalance in rationality here. Next, we come to the distinction of healing versus a Band-Aid. In other words, when you get AIDS or have an amputation, you can be given morphine or general anesthesia, and it will numb the pain of a wound that becomes chronic. On the other hand, in some situations, things can be healed, permanently transformed. Now, the government has allowed alcohol, which kills millions of people. Smoking, again, devastating impact, as legal ways to manage and cope with issues, to serve as a Band-Aid for cultural stress. But the deep healing that comes with ayahuasca, that comes with ibogaine, that comes with LSD, that comes with MDMA, is banned, creating chronic conditions that cost the healthcare system, that cost families, that cost the culture and the economy billions of dollars, because, for example, methadone does not cure opium addiction. It's just a legal substitute. But doing a deep ceremony has had a noticeable result, to such an extent that one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, who received a boost with their exploration of psychedelics, thought that it might be a very valuable part in a 12-step program, something that was shut down by the political stigma. We then come to the issue of stopping harm versus murdering. It's a very important distinction. Are you saving people's lives or are you killing people? Well, there is enormous data, despite the superstitious crackdown on all science in these areas. There is still enormous data that shows, for example, that people with arthritis, people with eating disorders, people with glaucoma suffer decades of severe harm in order to comply with the irrationality of the federal government. And so enormous harm was done. And in cases where you split a family, the mother or the father is imprisoned, leaving an infant with one child, with the stigma that their culture shames their parent because they smoked a joint, because they took MDMA, because they had LSD. A statistical number of those children are going to end up in the prison system that wouldn't in a when you have two parents. So there's a statistical corollary between breaking up families and shaming individuals and ruining careers and the abuses that children suffer, the lack of guidance that children suffer, the statistical numbers of those children that then end up in the justice system, and the statistical number of those children that get traumatized and become addictive to damaging drugs. There's a huge distinction between amphetamines or crack cocaine or heroin that destroy lives and LSD, which has zero toxicity. You cannot kill a person. You could drink LSD and you will not kill the body. So you have, in this area, very little harm is stopped, and there is an enormous harm done that results in loss of life and enormous suffering. You have a very important intention and distinction between creating well-being in a people and frightening and intimidating a people. And when you create well-being for a people, you do science, first of all, and you do studies, and you come up, we're only about the 10,000th history and language to exist in the entirety of human consciousness. Dolphins take psychedelics. In the neurotoxins within the pufferfish, they'll catch and send a pufferfish around. Dolphins will create altered states of consciousness. Bees will, birds will, mammals will. There's a long biological history, and culturally, the key thing is to involve it with rituals that are healing and bring the community together. We have a community and a culture in which people are falling apart, where people are dissociating at higher and higher levels, where they don't know their neighbors. You see, we're one of the few cultures in human history who experiences that level of dis-ease, of cultural dissociation. And rather than learning from the cultures that have had deep and total cohesion and low levels of violence and didn't need a police force because they actually knew how to interact together, we've been creating more and more fear and stigma in place of education and scientific design and cultural. As a result, our well-being is deteriorating to the point where loneliness, in one of the more recent studies, is an epidemic. 75% of Americans feel lonely. One of the issues that is addressed with restoring a greater sense of connectedness, that in the transcendent and entheogenistic aspects of psychedelics, where we remember that we are part of this earth and a larger organism. With that remembering comes decreases in loneliness, but we're doing the opposite by promoting fear at a governmental level. The non-addictive and addictive distinction is very important because drugs which are addictive, be they coffee, cigarettes, alcohol, sex, working too much, frantically being busy, the internal addiction to adrenaline, drugs that are addictive, constantly being obsessed with our phones, destroy relationships and reduce awareness and health. Substances that are non-addictive increase a sense of presence in the moment. And every one of the traditional plant-based substances are non-addictive and do not create damaging behavior. So you have 5-MeO-DMT from the Sonoran Desert toad. Zero addictiveness. People do it very rarely, even when it's available. You have DMT, not at all addictive. It helps to expand the sense of normal consciousness and understand just how big the mindscape is. You have LSD, which Francis Crick used in the scientific discovery of DNA. You have a long list of suppressed science where leading scientists used non-addictive psychedelics to create breakthroughs in science and technology, whether it's Steve Jobs, whether it's Bill Gates, whether it's Francis Crick, or all the people that talk about it under the radar. And yet, rather than blessing these plants for the gifts to our culture that they have offered, we have lumped them in with addictive substances, crack, cocaine, etc. And so it's a very big distinction whether you support substances that are non-addictive. Alcohol and cigarettes doesn't fall into that category. Coffee doesn't, but psilocybin mushrooms do, non-addictive. MDMA, non-addictive. LSD, not addictive. These are the kind of areas that we want to encourage, not repetitive addictive behavior, but open-eyed, opening, multidimensional, expanding behavior that help us be more present to our day. And unfortunately, the US government has not made this distinction and has falsely and unscientifically eliminated the most powerful non-addictive plant-based substances that are the very things necessary to challenge many of our cultural diseases, including the fact that before LSD was totally squashed out by the US government and before a war on consciousness was enacted, that the women's movement, that slavery, etc., that it's not a coincidence that the people who took LSD were the people that appreciated expanded sexual freedom, expanded nature honoring of understanding our role with nature, the environmental movement, the feminist movement, the awarenesses of consciousness and greater awareness of childhood abuse. These all emerged in the last 40 years. And we owe a great debt to these substances, which brings back into the correlation of murder. How much more killing has been taking place because these substances have been banished from science. We then have the distinction of leadership and political manipulation. And the distinction is that every leader, any leader that wants the best for their people, will look at the data, will look at the science, first of all, not at opinion polls, and will try and educate its people about how and why certain technology is best for their well-being. That's leadership. Political manipulation is the opposite. This is, whether it's Hitler or Stalin or Reagan, it doesn't matter who the leader is, when you create an illusory fear based on ignorance rather than science, and work people into guilt and shame and panic and fear, and then push them to give you more power to alleviate the fear that you engendered as a political figure. That's political manipulation. And it's having been a traumatized culture. We as a culture are afraid of the unknown. This is a fear that we all have. Unfortunately, psychedelics, in both positive and negative, take us into the unknown. So that fear of the unknown that comes from our traumatic history is very easy to exploit by unscrupulous politicians as a basis to gain more power rather than to lead us into a healthy world. And one of the things that's interesting is that most of the recent US presidents, having come out of presidency and no longer needing to manipulate and get elected, agree that the war on drugs is a disaster. Another key distinction is natural and artificial. Does it occur in nature? Now, this is an important distinction because we are a product of nature. We were not artificially created as human beings. We were born through a natural process by other consciousness that live and were grown on this earth. So when we create substances produced by nature, there's a higher probability that they're going to be balanced in the right way for our system than something that's man-made in a way that's never been tested before. And so in the natural category, you have alcohol, you have tobacco, you have coca leaves, you have MDMA, you have certainly mushrooms. You have a number of naturally occurring substances. You have endogenous DMT in our own brains, is a Schedule I drug produced by the pineal gland. Now, it's more important to regulate and test artificial substances. And yet, interestingly, the US government, while banning mushrooms, making it literally illegal to eat a psilocybin mushroom that has never killed anyone from your own garden, grown by nature, you're more than welcome to take any number of synthetic substances that have side effects where, nausea, possible death, blindness. You just read down all the various things that these artificially and federally approved substances contain, and it is absurd that the natural substances are being boycotted artificially while drug companies rush to spend billions of dollars to create less effective substances in many cases that are artificial and have enormous side effects. So it's not scientific, it's irrational. What I'm saying is an important part of the picture in this conversation. And so one of the distinctions that's also important to look at, and it's part of science, is the US government on the side of truth or lies? And this comes into lies are lies of omission, lies of evasion, lies of refusing to acknowledge what's in public interest. And we find the US government paying scientists to come up with bogus drug experiments that exaggerate the harm of drugs. And you have scientists confessing being paid by the US government to lie to the people. And then we have the suppression of truth in the form of science. And then we have the very active and willful ignorance of all the anecdotal data. And this conversation that we're having here cannot be had by anyone in the drug department because it doesn't look good. So they just avoid the conversation. That's an evasion. So we don't have a government on the side of truth in this domain. We then look at the positive impact and the negative impact on an entire governmental level relative to psychedelics. And so we can see that the government has imprisoned tens of thousands of its citizens to punish them for exploring consciousness in a non-addictive, non-socially threatening way. We see that the US government has censored research, scientific research on therapeutic protocols. We can see that our country is 50 years in the past over what it could have been had we had a country with the leadership and the humility to learn from cultures in the past and also learn from science, to actually trust science to grow. It's a miracle that Silicon Valley is now one of the biggest exporters of global value, helping the US economy, which is supposedly a capitalist country. It's supposedly a capitalist country, and yet the oppression of millions of Americans in prison is not good for the economy. So we're not really a capitalist economy. We're lying about that. We're not spending money intelligently on education and on care and medicine. We are murdering our people so that we can reallocate money to a war on more people who are exploring substances without the scientific guidance they would have had the government embraced truth. The world crime economy has more than doubled in size because the US government declared a war on its people that made no sense to its people. When you do not heal childhood trauma, which is an epidemic in American culture, people will go to addictive substances to numb the pain. We have not healed childhood trauma. What we have done is we have gone to war on the American people who are coping with pain with their addictions. And then we have lumped in a whole field of medicine in the form of psychedelics and banned these areas of possible relief and transcendence. I think it's fair to say that the economy, the culture, and the health of Americans have been hurt a good 30% by focusing on imprisoning and irrationally attacking its people, by failing it, by not spending those monies educationally, by raising an emotionally illiterate culture, and by spending 26 times more money militarily than the next country anywhere in the world. The enormous impact of amplifying irrational fear is not just felt around psychedelics. It discourages thinking. It escalates warfare, none of which brings well-being to the American people. So the US government's position is in many ways inferior to the criminals that were turned into criminals, to the US citizens who became criminals because of the system. There is not a single area in these distinctions around natural, no toxin. This is another very actually important thing. We've got toxicity and non-toxicity. So you have something like morphine, which can kill someone. Well, that's legal. You have general anesthesia that can kill people if you apply too much. That's legal. You have all kinds of very toxic legal substances that if you take a little bit too much, you're dead. You have alcohol, which kills people if you drink too much. There is no known toxic level of LSD. Meaning if you drank a gallon of LSD, there is no record of that ever killing the body. There is a record of it freaking out the underdeveloped Western mind, freaking it out. You know, it's too hard to process all that comes in psychologically in some cases. But on a physical level of toxicity, LSD is one of the safest substances. Psilocybin mushrooms. You're not going to die if you eat 300 mushrooms. You know, you got to have time for it to digest, etc. And again, you may be overwhelmed by the thoughts and feelings that this opens up. But the legal drugs, including crack cocaine or opium, etc., kill people all the time. And so this is another distinction that's being missed. And it's also, there are some psychedelics that do, it's called an LD50, the lethal dose at which 50% of people die. LSD doesn't have one. Mushrooms doesn't have one. Ibogaine has one. So that's something you have to use with a lot more care. Alcohol has one. You can smoke someone to death, with cigarettes, etc. if you consume too much smoke relative to oxygen. But LSD doesn't have any, and we don't make that distinction. DMT also. It's an endogenous substance in our own brain. Because of the amount of fear that has been created by the US government, and because of the low levels of science and education in this area, this is an important grid to examine. And the conversation for anyone that does not believe that there should be any basis for someone having the freedom to explore their own mind with a psychedelic substance should be based on a logical, data-based response to some of these metrics. The key crime in the US court is that scientists have been prevented in our culture from developing the safe contexts. We've developed a safe length, if you drive at more than X amount of alcohol, and we've educated everyone about that. And so that's more of a known variable, but we don't have that kind of education around what's the safe amount of LSD before you shouldn't drive, and protocols around that. We don't have that education because the science has been stopped. And it hasn't stopped tens of millions of Americans from taking drugs. It's just made that practice a lot more hazardous. Just like anything. If you use a sword without any training, you're going to hurt someone. If you drive a car without learning to drive, you're going to hurt someone. It's not the fault of the car. It's the fault of a government that refuses to train its people.